Jeff Korn, welcome to the Cipher Brief studio.
Thank you for having me.
It's really interesting what you and I have talked a little bit previously to sitting down to have this recorded conversation. And I was fascinated by the details of what you told me about your recent visit to the Middle East, who you were able to talk to, what you were able to see. Can you tell us a little bit about the group that you traveled there with, first of all, and we'll just kind of set the stage for people.
Yes, so I've been to Israel twice since January. The first time was with a group of retired American generals and admirals, sponsored by the Jewish Institute for National Security of America through their hybrid war task force. They will periodically put together groups of experts to make observations and write reports on the conflicts between Israel and its enemies, mainly Hamas, with some concern over Hezbollah. And then I was invited by another group very recently called the High Level Military Group. That's a group that was formed by Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard Kemp is a retired infantry officer from the United Kingdom Armed Forces who had extensive experience in operations in Afghanistan and Iraq and became very interested in what he believed, and I tend to agree, is a lot of the misinformation and disinformation related to military conflicts involving the Israeli Defense Forces, and has been a very vocal advocate for a more comprehensive and candidly operationally oriented understanding of the nature of these conflicts. I was aware of his group. I've done some events with Colonel Kemp on other venues. He invited me to join his group this time. The difference between that group and the Ginza group is his group is much more international. So we had a retired chief of the defense forces from Italy. We had a retired French general. We had a couple of former foreign ministers from the Netherlands, from Finland. We had a retired admiral and chief of the defense staff from Spain, a retired general from the United Kingdom Armed Forces, of course, Colonel Kemp, and another leader of the group is a former national security advisor to the Spanish government. So a very internationally diverse group of experts. And because of the connections that Richard Kemp and the former national security advisor for Spain have in Israel, they had arranged for very extensive access to understand the operational and at some point the tactical challenges that the Israeli Defense Forces have faced in Gaza. The first group had similar access, although I would say we focused a little bit more at the very high levels, the strategic level of planning and decision making. And the report from the first group is already available. That's on the ginza.org website, and I encourage readers or followers to review it. That involved General Rodriguez, the former commander of U.S. Africa Command, Admiral Rogers, the former commander of the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, a retired lieutenant general from the United States Marine Corps who was a deputy commander at CENTCOM. There were quite a few general officers of very, very remarkable expertise involved in that report as well. So I've had the privilege of being with an all-American group and with a multinational group trying to get a sense of what's really happening in Israel.
Yeah, which is, to your point, it's difficult to do. You've got a
Very
few major news organizations covering it, and being a recovering news correspondent for one of those operations, I can tell you it's sometimes tricky in terms of the access that you can get. So you actually, in the group, spent time inside of Gaza. Tell
Yeah.
me a little bit about how that happened and then about what you saw and what you did there.
So the Israeli Defense Forces has an international engagement office, and there's a colonel that runs that operation who was actually born in the United States. He's a dual U.S. Israeli citizen, and he, through his connections, was able to arrange with the 167th Division, which is the combat division that's principally responsible for operations in Gaza now, and is responsible for clearing Rafah. Was able to arrange with that division for us to visit their forward command post, which is right outside of the gate in Gaza, and then to actually go into Gaza and drive all along what's called the Philadelphia Road, which is the road that goes from the entry at Karim Shalom Crossing, which everybody's heard about in the news,
Mhm.
which is on the southern part of Gaza next to the Egyptian border, and runs all along the Egyptian border to the sea. So we traveled that entire route in a heavily secured convoy. You could hear the drone ahead above us the whole time. I think we were under uh, the wings of an angel in that sense for the entire movement, and were escorted by the deputy division commander, a colonel who on October 7th was studying national security studies in Toronto and was brought back for the operations and has been conducting combat operations in Gaza since then. So 9 months he's been conducting operations. And he gave us a very extensive briefing before we went in. And then we saw a couple of the activities that were going on inside of Rafah along that border, which was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about those. If we were sitting in that vehicle underneath that drone with you, I'm assuming you were all wearing body armor and the usual protection you would expect in an environment like that. And you're amongst a population that doesn't have any of that, of course. You're sitting in a very complex environment, an active military environment, where there are a series of tunnels. Obviously, that's one of the things that Israel is continuing to go after, the destruction of
Yes,
those tunnels.
yes,
I believe, and I don't think anyone knows this for sure, but that Sinwar, who is now recently elevated to the head of Hamas, is somewhere hiding in those tunnels. Tell me a little bit about, before we get into the military operations and the things that you learned about that, just tell me a little bit about the civilian population, what you were able to see, and how you think these people are coping with the situation there.
Well, let me just say that one of the other American that was in the group is retired General Dave Deptula from the United States Air Force. He wrote an excellent summary of our visit in Forbes, so that you can find that online. And there's a lot of detail in the summary he wrote. I helped him with it a little bit to make sure that the legal aspects were characterized properly. But um, you remember that when the IDF was talking about clearing Rafah, that Rafah was the last stronghold of conventional Hamas forces, which we learned when we were there, when I was there earlier with the Jinza group. The Israelis had attrited 18 of 24 Hamas battalions in their estimation. There were two in Khan Yunis and four in Rafah. So they saw being able to control Rafah and especially the border with Egypt to be strategically essential. And you remember that there was a lot of criticism that they'd never be able to clear the civilian population out, that it would take months to
Mm-hmm.
evacuate 1.5 million civilians. They did it in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Rafah is deserted. I mean, it really looked like almost like Berlin at the end of World War II. I mean, you have all of these structures that have suffered combat damage, but there was nobody there, and we could hear engagements in the not so far off distance. Mainly automatic gunfire sounded like fire from coaxial machine guns on armored vehicles, and the Israelis were definitely continuing to conduct operations in Rafah, but their estimation was that the only people that were still operating in Rafah were Hamas. Of course, that doesn't eliminate their obligation to do positive threat identification, but it was deserted. It was remarkable. I mean, I was thinking about all the imagery from the media of the Rafah crossing and the people stacked up at the border with Egypt, and how's everybody going to get out? Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely nothing but Israeli forces, some combat vehicles on picket duty, mainly protecting the Israeli assets that are drilling for tunnels.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and
That,
so
that's really the primary operation, the primary focus of the military in this particular area right now, right?
yeah, I think my sense is that the major combat operations are tapering off now. It's going to evolve into a counterinsurgency operation.
Mm-hmm.
They're under no illusion that it's not going to evolve that way. I think the IDF, for all of the rhetoric of destroy, eliminate Hamas, the IDF is wise enough to know that you can't drive a tank through an ideology. And what their mission was to make sure that Hamas was not capable of threatening the Israeli homeland with the magnitude of threat that occurred on October 7th. And that meant destroying their conventional capability. But the deputy commander did tell us that one of the surprises they had was the extent of the tunnel connection into Egypt. They knew there were tunnels going into Egypt. They didn't know how many. They didn't know how deep. They didn't know how extensive. Some of them are 70 meters deep that they've discovered. So, you talk about Sinwar and the hostages. I don't know that there's any assurance that they're in Gaza. They very well may have fled into the Egyptian side of the subterranean city that Hamas created over all these years. But the Israelis, the IDF recognizes that they've got to find those tunnels because that's the source of reconstitution.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to destroy an enemy's military capability, the doctrinal term destroy means to render combat ineffective absent substantial reconstitution.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that surprised them, and they were very candid about it, was the volume of armaments, the arsenal that Hamas had amassed in Gaza. They knew Hamas was a capable enemy. They didn't know how much resource Hamas had been able to smuggle in. And they're convinced that most of that came through that underground network running under the Egyptian border. So it's imperative that they identify and then figure out some way to destroy that tunnel access.
Yeah. Part of your visit there that was facilitated by the Israeli military was to sort of allow for some of these individual assessments, if you will, on the legality of the military action in the region, and whether this is operationally justified legally. And Jeff, I mean, you are the George Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and the director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University. What is your assessment coming out of what you saw in terms of, where they are, how close to that legal line they are getting with these operations, and some of the fog of war that we all know kicks in when there are messy military operations, and this one is extremely messy.
Yes. So, I mean, I don't purport to have anything near the level of expertise in military operations that the generals I've been involved with do. That's not why I'm included in these groups.
Mm-hmm.
I'm included in these groups because of my background and expertise, or apparent expertise, in international law, mainly related to military operations. So there are two levels of analysis that you have to go through when you're assessing the legality of a military action. The first is, are you justified in conducting the action, both in initiation and in scale? That's a self-defense question. And there's a body of law, international law, that regulates a state's authority to act in self-defense. You can act in self-defense against an actual or imminent unlawful attack, and you're required to take proportional measures to restore your security, to eliminate the threat. This is, I think, the first area of controversy over the military operation in Gaza. Self-defense under international law is not a tit-for-tat equation. There's no rule that says if the enemy kills 1,000 of your civilians, you're only allowed to kill 1,000 on the other side. It really is no different than if you're walking down the street and someone attacks you. It's just that the state is now the individual that's exercising self-defense. If somebody attacked you with deadly force or with a knife trying to kill you, you wouldn't be limited to responding with a knife. You're allowed to use the amount of force that's necessary, reasonably necessary, to restore your security under the circumstances. So for military leaders, this is when the national authority says your job is to act in self-defense, to restore the security of the state from this threat. They have to translate that into military operational objectives. The scale of the attack that occurred on October 7th, coupled with the fact that most people ignore, that Israel has tried periodically to use a much more limited self-defense response to Hamas aggression. 2014, 2020, they didn't act with this level of reaction because they thought they could manage the threat with a more proportional response. After October 7th, Hamas proved to Israel that that was a mistake. that the capability of this enemy necessitates actually closing with and destroying its combat capability. That means disrupting and defeating its combat formations. It means destroying its logistic base, preventing reconstitution, attacking command, control, and communication, and eliminating as best you can its underground, its subterranean fortress, which it created. So when we ask the question, was the scale of this operation justified as an act of self-defense? What I always suggest to people is, imagine you're the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, and the prime minister says to you, your job is to make me be able to tell our people it is safe to return home to the border with Gaza. What would you have to do to come back to the prime minister and say, you can tell them now with confidence that they will no longer be threatened from Hamas? And a pinprick response or a tit-for-tat response wasn't going to accomplish that. They had to go in with the scale they did. Another problem with the narrative is that, and we told this to the Israelis when we were there with the Jinza group, they make a mistake by characterizing this as a fight between the Israeli Defense Forces and terrorists. Because you, as a former media person, know when people hear you're fighting terrorists, they have this image of a loosely organized group of militants with maybe some Kalashnikov rifles and Molotov cocktails. That's not what Hamas was. Hamas was a terror army. They had battalions, companies, chain of command, logistics, advanced weapons technology. They had weapons manufacturing facilities underground, server farms, generation facilities. The Israelis, at the inception of the operation, committed 5 combat divisions into Gaza. When we found out about that the first time we visited, I almost fell out of the chair. 5 divisions? And their divisions are the same size as American divisions. So you're talking about 100,000 combat troops committed to the fight. You don't do that for a loosely organized terrorist group. You do that because the threat necessitates it. They were incredibly successful at it. They outwitted Hamas in the conventional battle quite effectively using maneuver and fire. But the suggestion that the scale of the operation was excessive because Hamas is not that bad, to me, is really troubling, because basically what you're saying to the people who live in Israel is, you just have to live with them. You just have to live with them continuing to harass you and threaten you and shoot rockets at you indefinitely. No other state would exercise self-defense that way.
I think we're really getting into the nature of the future of war and how difficult it really has become, because the criticism, I don't think, was primarily aimed at Israel because Hamas wasn't a justifiable threat. I think the criticism was, what if you were, for example, and it's a horrible analogy, I'm sure people will write in about this, but what if, Hamas was operating in New York City and you had to, as a measure to root out Hamas and make sure they weren't posing another threat, you had the lives of 10,000 Americans that were taken really as collateral damage in a war they didn't start. That's where this becomes extremely difficult.
Yeah.
In terms of the law.
Absolutely.
How do you even start to understand? Because so much of this is open to interpretation. What is the threat? When are they rendered no longer a threat to Israeli security?
Sure.
And
Well,
Hamas obviously isn't helping with this narrative by elevating Yahya Sinwar, who was believed to be the mastermind of that October 7th attack,
right,
to head of Hamas. So
right.
they're not really getting it, and they're not really showing any remorse by the fact that so many of their own people are dying. So
Well,
tell me
listen,
about the law here.
yeah. So the first level is, are you justified in your action? The second level is, are you justified in the means you're using to achieve your goals? Right? That's the law of war. And the law of war has limits on the amount of collateral damage and incidental death and injury you're allowed to inflict on civilians. This is widely misunderstood, right? So there's a proportionality rule at that level as well. But the proportionality rule under the law of war is not determined by counting casualties. The law that regulates the use of force in war, combat power, is a law that's focused on the attack decision, not the attack outcome.
Hmm.
So, what I mean by that is the commander is obligated to make a reasonable judgment that what he's attacking is a legitimate target and that the value of attacking that target is not outweighed by the anticipated risk to civilians and civilian property that will be hurt in that attack. Okay? It's not you attacked and you killed 30 civilians, therefore it was illegal. If you say, and I've heard this quite frequently, so have you, you've killed 30,000 civilians, that's too many. I have two responses to that. First off, if you say it's too many, you've got to be able to tell me how many were okay,
Mm-hmm.
which nobody can because it's an inherently arbitrary assertion. And secondly, saying that killing, I don't know, 50 or 100 civilians in an attack must be illegal is like saying 1 plus I don't know equals 10. Because you can't assess whether it was a reasonable attack judgment unless you know what the target was, unless you know what the assessed value of the target was, unless you know how that attack influenced the broader operation, and most importantly, unless you know what the attacking force did to try and mitigate civilian risk.
Mm-hmm.
I've said that I've written on this extensively and said this for years. The true touchstone of legitimacy in combat is the measures that a party to the conflict takes to mitigate civilian risk. It doesn't always work, especially when you're fighting an enemy that seeks to cause civilian casualties. And I'll come back to that in a moment because you talk about Hamas not getting it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're fighting an enemy that's deliberately commingling its assets with civilians in order to increase the risk to the civilian population, you have to still do everything you can feasibly do to mitigate that risk. And when we put that ledger on the wall and we look at what the IDF has done versus what the enemy has done, there's a clear discrepancy. And the IDF has made some remarkable efforts, I think, to mitigate civilian risk. That sets aside the whole debate over whether the numbers are even valid. And I don't think we really know. I mean, we're guessing to a certain extent. This is one of the reasons the IDF doesn't push back on the casualty numbers coming out of the Hamas-controlled health ministry, because it doesn't know for sure what the numbers are. No military does in the middle of a conflict. When we start clearing the rubble, we might find more civilian casualties.
Mm-hmm.
And when we actually do the detailed analysis, we're going to learn that many of the people alleged to have been civilian casualties were enemy fighters that are being counted. And so, but it's a mistake to gravitate towards that to begin with. What you have to do is you have to ask, is the IDF acting in good faith to try and mitigate risk while at the same time achieve its military objectives? My assessment is yes.
I was going to say, let's drill down on that very question because I'm interested to hear some 10 months into this now. Some of the things that you were able to see or able to learn about through the conversations that you had with IDF officers about what they're doing to try to mitigate the risks to civilians. What were some of the things that you saw that surprised you, if any?
Well, I'll start with what doesn't surprise me. I have worked with IDF lawyers over the years, and they are some of the most gifted international lawyers I've ever known. They're fully committed to playing their role in the military to demand that their military commanders respect international law. It doesn't always work. No military is perfect. We know this. We suffer the same problem. But their institutional integration of international law and legal advisors is very much analogous to that of our military, the British military, the Dutch military. So that's your start point. Now, some of the innovations that they implemented. For example, we had the opportunity to visit an entity they call the Civilian Risk Mitigation Center. So this is part of their Southern Command headquarters. It's a group of experts, Arab speakers, civilian experts, military lawyers, operational experts. Their singular function is to try and figure out ways to mitigate civilian risk in the execution of operations and inform the ground commanders of risks that they might not be aware of in order to help them mitigate them. They're the ones who came up with the designating areas in Hamas, dividing Hamas into specific areas so they could notify the civilian population, this is an area you want to get out of, this is an area you want to move to. Now, even that's been misunderstood because the media will often report the Israelis conducted an attack in a safety zone.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, there is no such thing as a safety zone in the battle space unless both sides agree to it.
Mm-hmm.
Under the Geneva Conventions, you can have two armies that are fighting each other enter into an agreement to create a neutralized zone. That's not what the Israelis did. What they did is they were telling people this is where the active combat is going to occur. This is where it's less likely to occur. You should move to that area. They were, according to the IDF, safer zones, not safety zones. They bombarded the civilian population with leaflets, text messages, every method they could to help them evacuate the most dangerous areas. They set up security for certain evacuation routes. And we saw videos of Israeli Defense Force personnel under fire from Hamas while they're trying to protect the movement of Gazan civilians out of the area because Hamas doesn't want them to leave. Mm-hmm. They created a fact-finding organization for serious incidents of violation. So remember the World Food Kitchen debacle, mm-hmm. where they attacked that vehicle because they thought it was Hamas. Those type of incidents,
of some of the World Central Kitchen employees.
Correct. Those type of incidents are submitted to this special fact-finding organization that's led by a retired Israeli general, includes military lawyers and experts from all of the domains of combat. And they do the initial fact-finding investigation. If they think there's any evidence of misconduct or it needs further investigation, then they refer it to what they call their military advocate general, which is their version of the JAG Corps. Mm-hmm. And then they will decide whether or not to transform it into a criminal investigation. There are 170 criminal investigations going on at this time by the military advocate general in relation to operations in Gaza and the West Bank, because we know there have been incidents of misconduct by Israeli soldiers. So again, another factor of legitimacy is if you think you can fight a flawless or perfect war with no mistakes, no misconduct, you're kidding yourself, right? As a retired JAG officer, this was our function in operations. Part of our function was to help commanders discipline subordinates who violate the rules. So the commitment to do that and the legitimacy of those investigations is very important because it's an indication of a commitment to the broader compliance requirement. And it's hard because you're dealing with a public that's angry and hurt and traumatized. And there are elements in Israel that are bitterly opposed to subjecting any IDF soldier to disciplinary action in relation to this conflict. Their attitude is, what are you doing? They don't deserve it. The enemy deserves to be punished. But when we were prosecuting Navy and Marine Corps personnel for alleged war crimes at Camp Pendleton, there were protests outside the front gate. We have the same phenomenon. What matters is the institutional commitment. And I will say, and I'll close with this, that one of the troubling aspects that we found in both missions was a disconnect between the political rhetoric and the commitment by the forces themselves. So we have Israeli politicians who make inflammatory, very troubling statements. Everybody's paying attention. The prosecutor at the ICC is paying attention. The International Court of Justice is paying attention. But I think even more troubling, the IDF is paying attention. And you're making it harder for those commanders who are trying to help their soldiers navigate the line between moral and immoral conduct in war by, making these bombastic political statements that suggest that there's no line between legitimate and illegitimate violence in combat, which is very troubling.
So the narrative between Israeli leaders and elected officials is not necessarily aligning with the narrative that's taken hold with those who are actually doing the day-to-day work.
I don't think it is. And I think in the long run, this is why these cases against Israel are going to fall apart. Mm-hmm. Because if these international courts are credible in their fact-finding process, what they're going to have to do is to see if they can find evidence of an alignment between the bombastic rhetoric and the actual conduct of military operations. And I think if they're credible, they're going to find an absolute disconnect between that bombast and the execution of combat operations, which is a credit to Israeli military leaders. And let's remember, they are not leading an all professional force like the United States has. They're leading reservists,
Mhm.
they're leading conscripts. It's
Mhm.
remarkable. I mean, I think it's truly remarkable, the not only the tactical effectiveness of the organization, but that there haven't been more incidents of misconduct when you're leading an organization that doesn't have the kind of opportunity to build the unit cohesion and the command relationship that you have in an all active duty force like the United States normally fields.
It's a really interesting point of context to this. I don't think a lot of people realize that as a citizen of Israel, you are obligated to spend time in the military serving your country in some way before you go on to your sort of final career. I want to kind of wrap up by asking you, now that traditional sort of military operations seem to be tapering off a little bit, now that the cave systems are still, the tunnel systems are still obviously intact, not intact completely, but they're still there. They're still discovering new things every day. What do you think the IDF is sort of going to shift toward in terms of their continued search for Sinwar and for other leaders of Hamas?
Yes, so I think we know what the IDF is planning to do. The problem is we don't know what the government is planning to do for the day after in Gaza. And
Mhm, mhm,
that in some ways is a real tragedy. The Ginza report really emphasizes this, the lack of strategic clarity
mhm,
on what the end state is going to look like is robbing the effectiveness of the tactical and operational brilliance, which is unfortunate. The IDF, I think, is very clear eyed that it's going to evolve into a counterinsurgency mission where you have a smaller footprint on they're going to control the border with Egypt. I don't think they're letting that go. That Philadelphia corridor that we went down, they're going to control that because
mhm,
they can't allow that to become a transit point for logistics for Hamas in the future. Their combat activities are going to be raids, and they're going to rely primarily on special operations to look for Hamas leadership and hostages. And when there's an apparent resurgence of Hamas capability, they're going to conduct raids into the territory. They told us in both trips that they envisioned the role of the IDF in Gaza going forward to be similar to the role of the IDF in the West Bank, when they periodically have to conduct raids into the refugee centers where there is a militant presence starting to emerge. And so that's how they see it. And one of the interesting discussions we had in the first meetings was with a very senior level Israeli general involved in operational planning. And we asked him, what do you think is the future? What's going to happen in Gaza? He said, we don't know. We don't have a strategy yet. Are we going to be an occupying power? Nobody wants to do that.
mhm,
Are we going to turn it back over to Hamas? Nobody wants to do that. The government has said they're not going to let the Palestinian Authority take over. And candidly, I don't think the Palestinian Authority wants it at this point. So
mhm,
there's this, I think, a bit of like a wish that some great and good international somebody is going to swoop in to take over. But if you saw Gaza now, I don't know why any other country would want to assume responsibility for that reconstruction. It's wrecked. And I do want to make a point about that because I think it's going to become the chronic issue for the media going forward.
mhm,
So he said, we don't know. He said, but I have two 14-year-old sons, and I'm convinced when they're 18, they'll be fighting in Gaza,
mhm,
which is kind of chilling. So
mhm,
the IDF is not naive. They know they're not going to be able to completely get rid of Hamas as a threat to Israel. But I think what they believe is that they've damaged Hamas so significantly that it becomes a manageable threat going forward. And in the context of the broader Iranian threat and the threat from Hezbollah, that's really critical. They have limited resources. They've got to redirect now. When we were in Gaza or in Israel 3 months ago, we visited a division headquarters on the northern border that was one of the first divisions in Gaza, and they were back on the northern border retraining and refitting for what they anticipated was a likely operation in southern Lebanon. So
mhm,
they've got to manage Gaza with a much smaller footprint. And that
mhm,
point about reconstruction, as the fighting tapers off and the killing tapers off, and hopefully that's sooner than later, I think the next issue is going to be people returning to their communities. And they are wrecked.
Hmm.
wrecked. And the media is going to follow them in. You know this. They'll be there with reporters from all the international organizations. And it's going to create an appearance, an image of Israeli indifference and excessiveness. The truth is, what the Israelis learned in their operations is Hamas had basically fortified every single building in Gaza. They would move from building to building, and they had pre-positioned weapons and ammunition so that they could fight from the building and then come out as if they were civilians. That was one of the things they encountered. And they told us, they said, we knew they were in some of the buildings. We were shocked that basically every building was a Hamas strong point. And the other thing they did is they booby trapped the buildings.
Hmm.
And they booby trapped the buildings even worse than what we think of, like a tripwire. They used cheap, like the backup camera in your car. They put them in the houses so they could watch the IDF go in and then command detonate the explosives. We saw a video of a captain from the IDF being killed as he entered into a home. It was captured from Hamas. You hear the commentary on it. They're watching, they're counting the number of soldiers getting out of the armored vehicle. So much of the physical destruction of these buildings is the consequence of Hamas's own tactics. But that's going to be a hard story when people go back and have to rebuild, because it is, as I said, I had never seen anything like that. The physical image of God of Rafah to me, and by the way, Rafah was a less destructive fight than Gaza City or Khan Yunis, but the physical destruction, it really did remind me of what it must have been like to drive through Berlin after World War II. It's a mess.
Yeah. Geoffrey Corn, the George R. Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and Director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University. Thank you so much for providing some context on the two trips that you have just recently taken to the region, including your time spent inside of Gaza. Thanks so much for being here, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.